Hi everyone, I'm Parsa Mufti and I welcome you to the Tryst. Today we are discussing the job crisis India faces. Each one of you has come so far because of your parents and support systems. You studied, worked hard, and graduated. You interned, acquired skills, and hoped to make your mark in society. And yet, lately, there are a few jobs. No matter how hard you try, you can't seem to get a job. You're questioning yourself, you feel depressed, and you don't know when it'll end. This describes the plight of nearly every young Indian. Youth unemployment has shot up threefold since 2012. For nearly 2 months, the BJP government has claimed that India's economy is on the path to a clear V shaped recovery. On the eve of Republic Day, President Ram Nath Kovind also commended the economy for recovering quickly after lockdown restrictions were lifted in phases. But does this revival translate into a recovery of the millions of jobs lost during the early months of the pandemic? For a country whose economy has been on a downward slope since demonetization in 2016, India's management of the pandemic proved to be the final nail in the coffin. According to data from CMIE, the country's unemployment rates shot up 8% in March 2020 to as much as 24% in April 2020, an immediate impact of the lockdown. Instead of a clear V shaped recovery, Indian joblessness has worsened in the past 2 months. In December 2020, unemployment rates rose to 9%, with as many as 90 lakh people losing jobs between September and December. In this context, it is imperative to assess what the government is doing to prevent a demographic disaster. To answer some of the questions, we are privileged to have with us Montek Singh Aloji, former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission, and Professor Santosh Mehrotra, former Advisor, Planning Commission, and Head of Department, Labor Studies Department, JNU. Some experts for hire have argued that India's job crisis has been exclusively caused by COVID. Others have argued that the other countries are facing similar problems as India is. These arguments partly seek to absolve the NDA government of any responsibility. Without getting into whether this is propaganda or not, these analyses gloss over the enormity of the problem India faces. After all, we must produce 1 crore jobs per year if we are to absorb the existing workforce effectively. But we aren't. So my first question is to Professor Mehrotra. How serious is India's job crisis?
Look, India's jobs crisis was serious even before the pandemic began, and it has become only worse since then. So let me say a few words about the pandemic and its impact. Let's remember the following: that while it's true to say that, as you were saying, that all economies of the world were impacted adversely, and the world economy has contracted. But the point is, among G20 countries, our economy has contracted the worst, both in the first quarter of 2020 as well as the second quarter. And our joblessness, which was already pretty bad before the pandemic, has actually increased, as I will explain in a minute. But tragedy is, this is particularly a crisis because the government was failing to acknowledge the crisis, recognize the crisis in the jobs field before the pandemic, and even worse, has even the economic survey of 2021 barely recognizes the crisis at all. Now, let's just recall what is the nature of the crisis here. Before the pandemic, we were already at a 45-year high in terms of unemployment rate, with youth unemployment having shot up from about 6% in 2012 to 18% on average, and I'm defining youth as 15 to 29-year-olds. And graduate unemployment had shot up from about 16 to 18% in 2012 to 36% in 2018. This is pre-pandemic. And in that 6-year period, wages had been falling. So you can imagine that after pandemic, the situation became much worse. In December 2020, the unemployment rate had actually increased to 9.1%, which is the highest rate since the rebound of the economy began in June 2020. And what's interesting is that while a rebound of the economy began in Q3 of 2020, In the last 2 months alone, the unemployment rate shot up from 27 million unemployed to 38 million unemployed in December 2020. And at the same time, those who have got jobs are seeing wages decline. And, and, and this is going to increase poverty, as I'm sure we'll get a chance to discuss. And I'm sure it has already increased poverty, although we don't have numbers about that.
Right, sir. Montek, sir, building on what Professor Mehrotra said, India bypassed the model which envisages that the workforce will shift from agriculture to manufacturing and finally to services. We jumped from agriculture to services, and yet there is an earnest desire across party lines to actualize this theory following the South Korean model. So it's likely that India may have missed the opportunities by China gradually moving away from manufacturing, which countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and others are lapping up. In that sense, can India actually rely on this strategy to absorb our workforce? And if we can't, what can we do to ensure jobs for all?
Well, I want to make one thing clear that although many people talked about India uh, maybe jumping over the manufacturing stage, that was never the policy of the government then, and it's not the policy of the government now. To my knowledge, most people that I know thought that we do need to have something like double-digit growth in manufacturing if we are aiming at sort of 7 or 8% growth of GDP. And our manufacturing sector relative to GDP should expand. And for the last 10 years, we've had this target of 25%. The share of manufacturing value added should be raised to 25% in the country. So that's something that has not actually been achieved. Let me say that, therefore, to call it a strategy implies that the government had consciously said, we don't want manufacturing, what the hell, we're going to jump over this and go directly to services. That was never the case. In fact, if you look at earlier plan documents, and Santosh helped write both the previous ones, you will see that there are many references to this fact that India must do a better job in manufacturing and also a better job in absorbing labor in manufacturing. And I think, frankly, although manufacturing, when GDP growth went up, manufacturing also went up. Didn't get to double-digit level, but it got to reasonably high level.
Can't hear.
Manufacturing. And I think this is another aspect which is a problem. The other thing is that when we talk about services, I mean, somewhere people have in mind high-end, sophisticated, high-income services. But actually, there was a lot of employment. If you look at the period up to 2012, and Santosh is the expert on this, so he will correct me if I've misread his own book, because it's all there in his book. One thing is very clear. In the growth period between 2004 and 2012, employment did better. So it is not the case that that high growth was not associated with any growth of employment. It was associated with the growth of employment, but not a growth of quality employment. A lot of the employment occurred in services. A lot of the services are low-end services. And even within manufacturing, when employment expanded, it was mainly informal contracts and not regular expansion. So, as far as the expectation of people is concerned, and this thing has only intensified over time, people are looking for better quality jobs. And the jobs that were being created were not good enough quality. Since then, even those jobs are not being created. I mean, remember, in the period up to 2012, the GDP grew at about 8%. And you can say it was a legitimate criticism of that 8% that it didn't produce enough quality jobs. Since then, GDP growth has collapsed. And so obviously, if GDP growth has collapsed, you're not even producing quantity jobs, let alone quality jobs. So you've got a double whammy. And I think what Satosh mentioned is also very important, that you cannot really talk about employment without talking about wages. I mean, you can have an increase of employment with a stagnation of wages. That's not going to make too many people happy. You could have an increase in employment with a decline in real wages, which many people think that, wages are too high, and if you lower them, you'll get an increase in employment. But that's not going to make people happy either. So actually, what you need is improvement in, I think, three or four different dimensions. One, you need the kind of employment that's associated with rising real wages. That's one thing. And that you certainly had in the period up to 2012. I mean, that's when poverty went down and all the rest of it. But even that, if it takes the form of an expansion of low quality employment, then many younger people who've got themselves degrees and educated and all the rest of it, I mean, it may be that they're doing better than their parents because they're doing relatively low skilled jobs for which they're suddenly getting a lot of money. But it's not job satisfaction for them. And I think more recently, if you look at the statistics on the rate of unemployment, the rate of unemployment is the percentage of people who were looking for jobs but didn't find jobs. But what we found in recent years is that the percentage of people looking for jobs has come down. So that's a fall in the participation rate. Now, there's a feedback loop here. If you don't produce enough jobs and they're not good quality jobs, a lot of people just walk out of the labor force. In which case, you can have a decline in employment, which I think Santosh talked about. But you don't have to have a decline in the unemployment rate because the numbers of people looking for jobs have gone down. Today, what you've got is a decline in the participation rate, a decline in employment, and you've got an increase in the unemployment rate compared to what it was a year ago. Plus, a lot of the employment that's currently being reported in the CMIE is really employment in rural areas. So what's really happened as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown, labor moved back out of urban areas into rural areas because they were doing very insecure jobs in urban areas, no continuity for job, no social security. Once you lose your job, it's not clear how you would survive. So they moved back into rural areas. Now, of course, we've heard about the problems that the migrants had in the process of moving back. But what I'm talking about is something different. Even if that had been handled very well, they'd been moved back reasonably rapidly, food on the available and all the rest of it. The fact is they've gone to the agricultural labor market, which generates much lower jobs. And you can see that from the fact that the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee, the demand for employment has really shot up. So whichever way you look at it, employment is a huge problem. But I would say that, again, a large part of the problem is simply that GDP is low. I mean, if GDP were to be bouncing along, some of this unemployment would disappear. But then you'd have to address the question that is our growth generating the quality of jobs we want? And there, by the way, you also need to think about something else, and which is the whole phenomenon of gig workers and so on. I mean, have we moved into a world where regular assured employment is simply going to be less important, and people are going to get jobs, but they're going to be insecure jobs, shorter term jobs, but high wage jobs? Frankly, we don't have a good picture of the way the scenario is changing. So we throw out these words, is employment a problem? And I think it is a problem, but exactly what we mean by that, we need to be more clear about. And of course, there's a totally separate issue. How do we fix that problem? Clearly, in my view, a very large part of the fix is getting back to high growth. You are going to have high growth in this coming financial year. That's just going to be a recovery. So the real question to ask is, what's going to be the growth rate in the year 22-23? That's when the economy is actually recovered from COVID. Now, remember, when you say recovered from COVID, it's still going to be lower than what it would have been if COVID hadn't happened. But you could say it's now stabilized and it's going to move up. And at what rate is it going to move up? Many people think that, if we were growing at 4.2% in the year before the pandemic, then the simple-minded answer would be that we would go back to something like 4.5%. That I can assure you will be no solution at all. It will lead to a much worse, greater worsening of the employment problem. Now, if we can get back to 7.5, 8%, then I mean a lot of the problem of creating numbers of jobs would be taken care of, but you would still have problems on quality and all the rest of it.
Right,
Partha,
sir.
before you ask me or ask Dr. Ahluwalia next question, let me supplement what Dr. Ahluwalia has just said on that sort of jobs question. I think the reason why the absolute number of poor fell in our country between 2004-5 and 2012, and it was for the first time in the history of our country, the absolute number of poor people fell uh, after 2004, never before that, was because non-farm jobs were growing at an unprecedented rate. They were growing at 7.5 million per annum. And that's a that rate after 2013 has actually fallen to 2.9 million per annum, from 7.5 to 2.9. So that was already the case before the pandemic. The second thing on manufacturing, jumping over the stages of development, let me just say that, okay, manufacturing share of GDP might not have risen over 2004 and 14, but the fact of the matter is that manufacturing was still growing at roughly the same rate as the GDP was growing. It might not have been the lead sector, so its share in GDP did not rise. And the point is that the share of manufacturing in employment was rising over that period from 4.5 to 11-12, because the economy grew, as Dr. Ahluwalia rightly said, at 8% per annum on average. Since 2013, the manufacturing share of GDP has actually fallen from 17% to 15% most recently, and the share of manufacturing in employment actually fell over the preceding 6 years before the pandemic, and the absolute number of workers in manufacturing fell. This is unprecedented in our history. These are the reasons why wages stopped increasing after 2012. They have been flat or they've fallen. As a result, poverty was increasing. Most probably, the government has not released the consumption expenditure survey, but poverty was increasing before 2019. So, let's just keep this in mind.
Right, sir. Looking at this year's economic survey, it's clear that agriculture is the only bright spot, with manufacturing and services being hit because of COVID. In that context, the three farm laws that have been recently passed will supposedly unleash animal spirits in the sector. Do you agree with this assessment, Montex, sir?
We're switching subjects now from employment to the farm laws. No, frankly, I think what's happened on farm laws is it's become a subject of political contestation. My own view expressed in earlier government reports. I mean, I do think that modernization of agricultural marketing, diversification of agriculture, moving out of cereal production into horticulture, into the kind of production that depends a lot on agro-processing. I mean, this is the way for Indian agriculture to go. And in that context, I mean, the two things that I've always been in favor of. One, I have been totally opposed to the Essential Commodities Act. I mean, I've been saying this even during UPA times, that it's a draconian legislation that should be got rid of. I think maybe that is one of the least controversial of the legal initiatives, legislative initiatives that have been taken. On the issue of how to introduce more private sector activity into the marketing for agriculture, I think a good case can be made that we do need to modernize the agricultural marketing system. But I think what has happened is that there was a perception that this was not adequately discussed, it was pushed through without consultation. So many of the complaints that have been made really relate to process issues. You know, part of the problem, frankly, is that at least when I was in government, it was our reading that these laws can only be passed by state governments because agricultural marketing is a state government subject. Since then, I think the present government has interpreted the constitution in a way which enables them to pass certain laws within the four corners of the constitution. Now, I'm generally in favor of constructive approach to the constitution. So I wouldn't say that, I mean, I'm not an expert. This is for the Supreme Court to pronounce on. But you know, when you do something which has been discussed for a long time, you do need to consult, and you need to consult widely. And I think the if you look at any of the protests that the farmers are making or their representatives are making, they're emphasizing the fact that there wasn't enough consultation. Now, it's also true that in the farm protests, you know, a different angle has also come in, that bringing in the private sector is equal to bringing in crony capitalism, and this will exploit the peasantry, and this, that, and the other. You know, I think these are things that we need to, obviously, you need to be watchful. You don't want to get rid of a government monopoly and substitute it by a private sector monopoly. So the question is, what are the kinds of legal changes and the regulations that go with them, which would essentially ensure a vibrant private market? And I think that's not beyond, that's a standard kind of problem, which any good economist should be able to handle.
Just adding on to what you've just said, Montek, so 86% of India's farmers are small and marginal farmers, and it is expected that their bargaining power vis-a-vis the agri-corporates will reduce over time. So additionally, it's also likely that with compounding pressure of higher input costs and increased land fragmentation, etc., many of these small and marginal farmers will leave agriculture and migrate to towns and cities over the next 5 to 10 years. So if even 6% of farmers migrate, that's an additional 6 crore Indians looking for jobs in cities. Won't that exacerbate India's existing job crisis, and how will we address this problem?
Well, it's a fair question, but let me say, I don't think you can jump to that from the farm laws. I mean, I think it would be a bit of a mistake to think that the farm laws are going to cause, because the farm laws are being objected to, that they will lead to farmers migrating out. I mean, the fact is that even before these farm laws, we need to reduce the pressure of population on our land. I mean, let's be very clear about it. In fact, it's one of the positive developments of the last 10 years that we've actually seen a faster reduction in the percentage of the population dependent on agriculture. And I think Santosh will correct me if I'm wrong, actual reduction in the absolute number also dependent on agriculture. Let's be clear about it. This should not be regarded as a failing. I mean, this is actually the beginning of a success story. The failing is that while this is a natural process that is bound to happen, we're not delivering to these people the kind of non-agricultural, non-farm growth which would enable them to earn a living outside agriculture. And the failing is there, not, I think, on the agricultural side.
Right, right, sir. Professor Mehrotra, what do you think about the impact of these farm laws on India's workforce?
Okay, let me just make one point about the farm laws, which needs to be emphasized, that it's no one's argument that agricultural marketing should not be reformed. I think the previous government was also attempting to do that. The point is that the previous government's approach was somewhat different. It was enabling state governments and pushing state governments and passing model laws, etc., and encouraging the state governments to do this, because in the final analysis, agriculture is a state subject, and that process had been moving along in most states. I think part of the problem with the farm laws is precisely the fact that the central government has passed it through without much consultation, and that's something that Dr. Ahluwalia has already said. But let me respond to your specific question about the impact of the farm laws on jobs. I just want to re-emphasize something that I said earlier and was reinforced by Dr. Alwalia, which is that the answer to the problems of agriculture lie outside agriculture, meaning workers must move out of agriculture. And because the growth rate of growth rate economy had really increased to 8% between 2004 and 14, and the non-farm job growth had risen to 7.5 million per annum over that period, we saw that 5 million people were leaving agriculture every year for the first time in India's history from 2004 to 2012. What has happened as a result of the pandemic is workers have gone back. Million workers have gone back. I mean, that process of workers leaving agriculture had continued all the way till 2018-19, but workers have now gone back. And this is a great tragedy, which is reducing incomes there as it is. So there was prior rural distress, and rural distress is going to only increase because there is much greater joblessness in rural areas. And now let me come to the farm law specifically. You see, the farm laws are particularly going to impact those who have a marketable surplus. Who has a marketable surplus? It's not the marginal farmer who owns less than 1 hectare of land. They normally produce for self-consumption. However, the small farmer, which is 1 to 2 hectares, and the medium farmer from sort of 2 to 5 hectares, and also the large farmer, they are the ones who produce the marketable surplus, tend to benefit from MSP. And so let me just sort of do away with a myth that only 6% of our workforce is impacted positively by the MSP. It's much, much larger than that. I just said that small, medium, and large farmers produce a marketable surplus, bring it to the mandi, and if the mandi was to deteriorate in its in its functions, and private markets, which are needed and which are already in existence, took over the mandi's role, I think there's a risk that the incomes of farmers, and if the might decline, and if incomes of farmers decline, then something will happen to the workforce. Let me explain what might happen. Who has been leaving agriculture in the past, in the last preceding 15 years until 2019? It's the landless labor. It is the marginal farmer. The small farmer and the medium farmer has not left agriculture. They might have 1 or 2 members of the household who might have gone. But if you see, unless if the result of the farm laws is that because of the power of large companies and large cartels, they are able to bring down the price of produce brought to the market by small, medium, large farmers, and that is possible because they are likely to be in an oligopolistic position, while the farmers who are the sellers are in their hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Then the result of falling incomes of the rural of these farmers will lead to immiserization, and more people will leave. So this is one thing. Now, as far as contract farming, the second law is concerned, contract farming could work in the interest of medium and large farmers, but for small farmers, it's unlikely to work unless there is group farming available. But group farming requires the potential of the state to enable group farming. Now, in Kerala, it's a reasonably strong state. It has encouraged and enabled group farming by small farmers. But most states will be unable to intervene. So one of the critiques of the farm laws is precisely that where is the countervailing power? Meaning, and who's going to regulate the large companies who might become buyers?
Right, sir. Professor Mehrotra, I also want to talk about women labor force participation. What has been happening in the last few years with regard to women's employment, and how has COVID impacted them?
Well, let me make 2 or 3 points. First, I think you have to understand what was the situation preceding the crisis, the pandemic. The labor force participation rate for women had been falling, and there are two most important reasons for this happening. Firstly, for poorly educated adult women, they were mostly working in agriculture, and as mechanization and happened in agriculture through processes that I think are beyond the discussion of beyond the rubric of this discussion, these women came out of the workforce. So the labor force participation rate. Now, these are women who are poorly educated, so they can't really find jobs which are meant for educated young women. Therefore, what we need to do for them is very different. We need to encourage them into non-farm work through self-help groups. But the second reason why the labor force participation rate of women was falling pre-pandemic was because girls were getting better and better educated. Uh, so I won't go too far into that. I've written extensively on the subject. The point is their education meant that they are not going to be in farming any longer. In any case, farming is losing work. But they are going to be looking for urban jobs, non-farm jobs. But are they growing or not? And the problem is that they were growing, and they are not growing for the last 6 years, and the situation is much worse. And the pandemic, well, I mean, what we know as a result of the pandemic and in the course of the last year is that more women lost jobs who were in jobs. So first of all, we are now moving to the urban areas. In the urban areas, labor force participation rate is in any case lower for women than it is in urban areas. And those women were the first ones to lose the jobs, not so many men. And it's a bit unlikely that they will return to the workforce because jobs are not growing. As we've been discussing, joblessness has been growing. So, I mean, this is a really serious problem for these younger girls who have gotten better and better educated and would want to enter the labor force, and they don't want to necessarily marry. I mean, Nandi Foundation survey across the whole country of teenage girls, 13 to 19-year-olds, asked this question in 2018. What do you want to do? When do you want to get married? And they said, about 25% said that we want to marry after the legal marriage age between 18 and 20, and 51% said that we want to marry between 20 and 25. So what would they want to do? Obviously, they would want jobs. So clearly, they would want jobs in urban areas, in industry, in modern services, close to where they have studied.
Right. So, Professor Mehrotra, many of our viewers are also from the SC, ST, and OBC communities. Could you also enlighten us how unemployment amongst Dalits, Adivasis, and OBCs in the past 6 years has impacted them, and how COVID has also exacerbated the problem?
Well, we don't have data in respect of the impact on the Dalit jobs or Adivasi jobs post-pandemic, but we do have data. I've done this analysis, and what comes out very sharply is that between 2013 and 2018, the scheduled caste and the OBC unemployment rate is higher than for upper caste Hindus. I can just give you an example by looking at what happened. What was the in 2018, the graduate unemployment rate for SCs was 38%, and for OBCs, and for SCs it was 41%. But it was lower in the case of upper caste Hindus. It was only 35.6%. And for those who had vocational training, among SCs, it was 40% in 2018, 36% for OBCs, but only 30% for upper caste. So this was the situation prevailing then. So clearly, what is the meaning of this for the COVID impact? If women have been most affected, if the young have lost jobs, then it's highly likely that the SCs and STs are affected more.
Right, sir. Montek, sir, many nations have become aggressively protectionist because of COVID. The USA and Europe are just two prime examples, and many of these countries are also revisiting their visa policies. Given India has a vast services sector, won't the diaspora Indians and those wanting to work outside be badly hit?
Well, I mean, the question is limited to what will be the impact on those Indians who want to work abroad. Is that the issue? Well, sure. I mean, I think the likelihood, the United States being one of the major destination markets, I think we've got a new administration there. It's talking a slightly different language. There's some expectation that on visas, they may be less restrictive and negative than the previous administration, but we have to see. However, I think generally it's true that countries hit by the pandemic sort of react negatively to immigration because they view immigrants as taking away jobs which could be had by local people. So I think until the world economy gets back on even keel, this element of what used to be an important part of opportunities for Indians will not be as bright as it was. I think more generally also there's a tendency in these countries as a result of changes in technology to focus on what they now call reshoring of jobs rather than offshoring of jobs. But I'm not so convinced that that will what the net effect of that is going to be. But certainly, it's not going to be an increased in likelihood of expanded immigration. It could be that the negative impact is somewhat overdone. That's a possibility, but certainly it doesn't augur well for that kind of activity in the near future.
Sir, coming back to domestic issues, Montek, sir, many dominant communities like the Marathas, the Gujars, the Patels, Kapus, etc., have been demanding reservations in jobs. Clearly, this is partly because of the stresses in agriculture and partly because of high unemployment. Is enhancing reservations, basically public employment, a sustainable solution to ensure jobs for all? And if it is, and if it's not, then what is a sustainable solution?
Well, I mean, certainly, you can understand that when you have reservations, uh, sort of you've legitimized reservations as an instrument. Anyone who doesn't have reservations will demand that they should also be eligible for them. That's not surprising. It's for the political process to determine how to keep those demands under check. Because, in a way, if you keep conceding to those demands, what it means is that reservation is not binding. I mean, if everybody who's not in the reserve category is declared to be in the reserve category, then you don't have any reservation. So I think that's an issue that, in different states, political processes will determine who actually deserves to be counted in the eligible category for reservation. It cannot be a solution to the jobs problem. It's only a way of dividing available jobs among different people. So clearly, if you're talking about what will increase the total number of jobs, reservations have no effect on that whatsoever. Reservation will only affect how the total number of jobs are distributed between different eligible parts of the population. Now, I think you had a second question, which is, if these are not the solution, what is the solution? Well, I mean, the short answer to that is what we were discussing earlier. We need to go back to a much higher growth rate than we have been getting even before the pandemic. And also, we need to ensure that this growth is of a kind which is more inclusive. So I want to emphasize this because there are growth processes which can generate GDP growth but won't generate much employment. I mean, for example, if you had a growth process which depended a lot on exploitation of minerals and mining, that is not likely to generate as much jobs as if you had a growth process that was based on construction of infrastructure, which creates a lot of demand for people to build the infrastructure, or a growth process that concentrated on expansion of simpler manufacturers, which tend to be much more labor intensive. One of the ways of getting the latter is to get a larger share in world markets for these goods. Because remember, industrialized countries will resort to protection to protect the jobs that they currently have. They are not going to resort to protection to protect jobs which they've already given up. I mean, many of these low quality manufacturers, or not necessarily low quality, but simple manufacturers, are not things that the richer countries want to produce. At their levels of income and wages, there's no way they can be competitive. But others are producing them. And I mean, we face a real issue that on the one hand, you have possibly the most successful country to exploit international labor markets to its advantage, and that's China, had a huge position in the simpler manufacturers, export of simpler manufacturers, which generate a lot of employment. As they become more developed, as their incomes and wage levels rise, they become uncompetitive in these areas, and they will relinquish these areas and move to higher technology areas. The Chinese have certainly already signaled that they see themselves as devoting much more effort to succeed in those areas and kind of vacate the low end manufacturing. So the question really is that who is going to be filling that place in global markets? Are we going to do it? Is Vietnam going to do it? Is Bangladesh going to do it? Right now, Vietnam and Bangladesh are doing better than India. So I think we need to ask ourselves, what is it about our policies that makes us uncompetitive globally? It's not something that goes against the government's own intentions, because the government has said that we want Indian industry to become competitive. We want to link up with global supply chains, all of which is good. So the question we have to ask is, what are the policies that would achieve that objective?
Right, sir. Professor Mehrotra, even if India can create 1 crore jobs per year, many studies have repeatedly pointed out that over 50% of India's graduates are unemployable. That is, they're not graduating with the skills needed. This is clearly a structural problem. Yet, 6 years after NDA skilling India, and with various experiments in higher education, the problem is worse than ever before. Why, and what needs to be done?
So I think I'm going to take this question up in two parts. First, let me talk about the higher education system and its problems, and then I'll speak to the subject of vocational education and training. Now, please understand what has happened with our education system overall. By the year 2007, India had achieved net primary enrollment rate for grades 1 to 5 of 97%. As a result, over the next 2 or 3 years, by 2010 or so, we had already universalized upper primary as well. That means for grades 6, 7, and 8. There was upward pressure on account of that, and that resulted in the following: that secondary enrollment rates for grades 9 and 10, meaning for 15 to 16-year-olds, those shot up in a matter of 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, from 58% to 85%. And that happened with gender parity. In other words, girls were also continuing to be in school, not just going to school, something that I was discussing earlier, which is one reason why they were dropping out of the labor force. Now, the result of this upward pressure in the school system as higher secondary education expanded, the higher education system, the tertiary education system, also expanded very rapidly. So in 2006, the gross enrollment ratio for 18 to 23-year-olds, which is the relevant age cohort, shot up from 11% to 26% in 2016. From 11% to 26% in a matter of 11 years, on a rising base, meaning the denominator was rising because the young people entering the higher education system, or that age was rising. Now, that's massification of tertiary education in our country happening very, very rapidly. When you get massification of tertiary education that rapidly, inevitably quality is going to decline. When quality declines, employability would fall. But it's not just that. I think we were demonstrating to you earlier that the number of non-farm jobs, which is what educated young people will look for, they were not growing as rapidly. Their numbers began to fall. So you had many more millions looking for work with better certificates, higher and higher certificates, but jobs were not growing. This is one problem. This is on top of the skills that they are acquiring, because the skills that they are acquiring in the education system are going to be compromised if the system expands very rapidly. This was one set of problems. So how do we solve this problem? And to my mind, the answer does lie in vocational education and training. How? You see, if the numbers of those who are acquiring general schooling, general academic schooling has shot up, it's pretty much universalized, then they need not be necessarily all going to tertiary education, because what they are currently doing is they get into colleges whose numbers have grown at the rate of 4 per day. Affiliated colleges to universities rising 4 per day between 2000 and 2016. Now, instead of their going to tertiary education, couldn't they be diverted to vocational education at secondary level, at higher secondary level? They should be. And the system, the TVET system, vocational education training system, should have expanded much more rapidly. And that's been a massive failing. Now, what's been another dimension of the Skill India program, that is that it's government driven, it's government financed, it's mostly government managed. But that means supply driven programs. What you need is demand driven programs, which are mostly industry driven. And that's when this employability issue can be resolved, because industry needs to engage very directly in the vocational education. And that means that our ITIs, which are among the best of the 4 or 5 pillars of our VET system, need industry management to a greater degree. Apprenticeship has certainly increased. The numbers who are in apprenticeship have increased post the Skill India reforms that have taken place. But the tragedy is that the school vocational education, which has expanded, does not involve industry. And that's a problem. Secondly, the National Skill Development Corporation, which was created, that has led to a mushrooming of short-term training through private vocational training providers. And short-term 3-month training does not do much for kids who have got poor quality general academic education. So you have half-educated youngsters, 15, 16-year-olds, entering these short-term training, and then you quarter skill them, because a proper VET program takes at least a year to skill. So the result of all of this is that the demand has not grown for vocational education, despite the fact that the need is growing. And the result has been that despite Skill India, the share of formally trained vocationally trained in our workforce has grown from merely 2.3% in 2012 to 2.4% in 2018, which means an increase of 0.1%. That's a failure, if anything is a failure of Skill India.
My last question is to both the panelists. Many world-class PSUs, including the Maharatnas, are being commercialized and their employees are being laid off. This is in stark contrast to China, which uses its PSUs to further its geopolitical and economic goals. Why is India so disinterested in using PSUs for national security goals? Montek sir, starting with you.
But I don't know what you mean by the Chinese experience with the public sector organizations. Now, clearly, they have very many public sector organizations. But most readings of what the Chinese do suggest that a lot of their growth has come from what they call non-public sector organizations. I realized that in China, there's no such thing as purely private sector. So what are non-PSUs are really, if you like, run in some sense by private sector managers, but very much under the watchful eye of the government. But clearly, if you're referring to purely the security side, in many countries, the PSUs play a large role. I don't think there's anything wrong in our departing from an excessive dependence on PSUs, actually in all fields, not just in the security field. So I think the moves that are being made to bring in the private sector to a greater extent make a lot of sense. And I don't know whether you had in mind any specific decision where you feel that the government, either this one or the previous one, has relied too much on the private sector instead of pushing for PSUs. So I'm not sure about that.
Um, I broadly go along with what Dr. Ahluwalia has said. I just would add the following, that there is a case for certainly privatizing and divesting in PSUs which are not doing well. There is certainly a case for privatizing, if not, if and divesting in public sector banks, because many of them have notched up extremely high NPAs because of governance failures. Having said that, the suspicion is that with the current government, the reason for doing a lot of this is because there is a fiscal crisis, and the government needs money to, to rake in funds. Um, that's the least credible reason for actually privatizing firms. Our country cannot afford to continue to pump in resources into loss-making either public sector banks or public sector enterprises. And it's critical that gradually there is divestment taking place. Because the government needs to conserve its tax revenue and borrowings for investing in health, in education, in infrastructure, and also in agriculture infrastructure, if we are going to resume an 8% growth momentum.
Right, sir. I think it is clear from today's discussion that unless urgent steps are taken, India's demographic dividend can turn into a time bomb. Let's just hope that the government is listening. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. Thank you.
Every country in the world experiences the benefits of its demographic dividend, a period that comes but once in the life of a nation, when the share of the working age population is larger than the non working age share. It has the potential to make a country progress towards higher incomes and development, but it can also become a nightmare if there aren't enough jobs. Since 2012, the number of youth entrants into the labor force has increased at an accelerating pace, while the number of jobs created has decreased. This situation might become graver between 2020 and 2030 as the labor force swells further. Reviving Jobs, the third volume in the Rethinking India series by SBF and Penguin, offers suggestions on how India can make the best use of the remaining period of its demographic dividend. Any failure to do so will cause millions to suffer in poverty for decades to come. This volume has been edited by Professor Santosh Mehrotra, former advisor to the Planning Commission and head of Department of the Labor Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. It contains essays from various experts detailing India's job crisis, and it serves as a blueprint for those who want to find solutions to the crisis in the years to come. Swipe up and find the Amazon link in the description box and buy your copy today.